It's just beginning a new build for my quadcopter. Going to solder up the Maytech XT60 PDB. I like to use some sticky tacky to hold things down as I solder, and I'll go ahead and show you as I get started here. I like to use 725 degree Fahrenheit when soldering these pads, and as far as solder, I use a 6040 rosin core 0.032 inch diameter solder. That's just what I prefer. I think it's a good gauge, good thickness. It works for almost everything that I do, so that's what I use. And I have a Haku X888D soldering iron that works really nice. If you're in the market to get one, I highly recommend it. So let's go ahead and get started here. Go ahead and just apply a liberal amount to each pad, which I'll later be attaching each ESC to, as well as the VTX and the flight controller. And also it comes with this XT60 connector, hence its name, the Maytech PDB XT60. So, okay. Since I'll be using the two side pads here, I'll solder up all these. Alright, as you can see, I have soldered up the PDB here. It's all pretty straightforward, and going to hook up the XT60 connector, which the battery will plug into. One important thing to note is the negative terminal on here will be the one with the pointed triangle angle here, and the positive will be the squared end. So it should attach kind of like so. Alright, I've finished up with the PDB. Have the ESC positive and negative terminals wired up, the 5 volt as well as the 12 volt, and the VCC and ground wired up for that, and also the XT60 connector wired up. I'll catch you guys soon. Now just going to wire up the ESCs to the motors. I have 30 amp Maker Fire ESCs. I've removed the heat shrink, so the little heat sink has come loose, but I'll just zip tie it later. Going to pre-solder the 3 pads right here, and then I will wire the 3 motor wires to them, and I will reverse 2 of the motor wires for the counterclockwise motors to reverse their direction that they spin. But pre-soldering, just pretty basic, very similar to what I just did with the PDB. And then I will pre-solder the wires for the motors and then connect them. Okay, so that is done. nice joints there. I will pre-solder the wires and then connect them. So I have soldered up those wires to the ESC, and they're all just running in parallel because these are the clockwise motors. With the counterclockwise motors, we will reverse 2 of these wires, and it can be any 2 of the wires. Alright, so that is all complete. I have all 4 ESCs wired up to the motors. As you can see, the clockwise motors, or the counterclockwise motors with the silver nuts, have 2 of the wires reversed, and the clockwise motors are all in parallel. And now I will move on toward wiring them up to the PDB, which I soldered earlier. Guys, so just finished up cutting all the ESC wires to length. As you can see here, they're all nice and short. There was a positive and ground, as well as a signal wire, which had a ground and a signal. I'm going to go ahead and run my ground to the ground pads on the PDB, and I'll just run the signal wires to the flight controller, and I'll just rely on the ground wire that goes from the flight controller to the PDB to provide ground for those signal wires. In the earlier video, I already pre-soldered the pads on the PDB. So now I'm pretty much just going to connect up all these wires to the PDB. There's positive and negative, so all the black wires I'll run up to negative, and then the positive wires I'll run up to, the red wires I'll run up to positive. So right now I need to pre-solder these wires to get them ready, so I'm going to go ahead and do that now. Okay. Alright, finished pre-soldering the wires from the ESCs. Gonna go ahead and connect them up to the motors now. that's the first 4 there. I twisted the ground wires a little bit to keep them nice and neat. Gonna go ahead and start on the second half here. Alright, I know that took a while. I spent some extra time trying to clean up those solder joints. 1 or 2 of them didn't go as I had hoped. Some of the silicone insulation around one of these ground wires got a little messed up, and I had to strip it again once or twice. But everything's looking really good now. Super happy now. So here's the final result. Other than that, everything's pretty much wired up. Now I just need to attach the flight controller and wire up the signal cables. Stay tuned. So one thing I can do real quick just to test how well I soldered up the PDB and ESCs with the motor is to actually just do a quick battery test. The ESCs should power up and make their startup sound, but they won't make the complete sound or melody because they don't have the actual signal cables wired up, but should be able to tell by plugging the battery in. Hopefully there's no smoke, which would indicate that I potentially crossed one of these joints, but that shouldn't be the case. Everything looks pretty well. Okay, so that was that kind of startup sound. I'll go ahead and do that again. So, no smoke. Everything seems to be hooked up pretty well and sound. So we will go ahead and continue on to the next phase of hooking up the flight controller and soldering up the signal wires and wiring up the 5-volt and ground to the flight controller. Stay tuned. Welcome back. So going to solder up the signal wires from the ESCs into the flight controller. So if you take a look here, we have these 4 white wires which are coming from the ESCs, and we need to wire them up into the signal pads. So the top ones, which are the square pads, there's signal, then positive, then ground. These ESCs don't have a positive, and we've already run the ground to the pads on the PDB, so all we have to do is run them to the signal there. So there's 1 through 8, and essentially when we set this up in beta flight, this is ESC 1, 2, 3, 4. So this being the front of the quad and this being the rear, it's 1, 2, 3, 4. So I already cut all these wires to length. I try to leave just a little bit of extra room in case I had to move something, but I'm going to go ahead and pre-solder the tips of these wires, and then I'll run them through the holes here, and then I'll solder them. The other thing I forgot to mention is that for these smaller pins here, for the smaller solder pads here and the smaller wires, I don't like to use the standard iron tip. I have a much thinner one which I prefer using, so that's just worth noting in case you have multiple tips for your soldering iron. So I have soldered up the 4 signal wires. I left them a little long on purpose so that I could just feed them through well, because I can always now cut them. So if you look, there's a little bit of an extra wire sticking up there. So I'm just going to snip those with my side cutters. Alright, now those should be good, and we can, I can move this back into place like so. So now I need to run the 5-volt and ground from the PDB to the flight controller. In order to do this, I'm going to need a positive wire and a ground wire, so I like to just use the extra cables that I have when I cut the these off of from the ESCs. I like it because it's the same gauge wire that I already have running to the signal wires, or the signal pads on the flight controller. So I will just go ahead and cut these off from here. And then I will strip them and tin them. So now that I have those pre-tinned, has a little bit of issue there, we can run these positive and ground to any one of the terminals here. So I'll run one of them to the positive and one of them to the ground. Now all these pads are actually run in series here. They're all connected on the same circuit. So I can put them on any one of these and it won't matter. So what I'm going to do is, just to give them a little bit of space from these 4 signal pads, I'm going to put the positive one probably right here in number 6, and I'll probably put the negative one over here in like 8 or something. And that should be good. Oh, and then I will run the 5-volt and the ground, which is right there. So these 2 guys, which I already pre-soldered earlier in the video. We have the power running to the flight controller right here on top. We should be able to do the battery test, and we should get the full melody from the ESCs now. So it should go doo doo doo, and that's that they have power. And then that is that they are receiving the feedback or whatever on the signal line. So let's go ahead and see. Okay, so that sounds good. And the lights look good, everything looks good, no smoke, so we're golden. I'm going to go ahead and wire up the VCC and ground to the VBAT on the flight controller. So that will go ahead and consist of me wiring this VCC and this ground up to the VBAT pins that are right here. So just like before, I will cut those wires and pre-solder them and then wire them into those pins. That will give us the battery reading on our radio telemetry eventually. So I'll go ahead and get started. Alright, so I just finished up with that. The VBAT negative and positive are now wired up from the PDB there into the flight controller, and so now we should be able to get battery voltage readings to our flight controller, which can then in turn transfer them to our radio via the receiver. So stay tuned, and we will next wire up the receiver. I'm going to go ahead and hook up the Far Sky X4R connector or receiver that I have right here. I already stripped the cardboard that comes around this normally, which looks like this, and just because I'm going to actually waterproof my drone later, so I've just took all this off now. Now to wire this guy up, I'm going to use the S port, and I'm going to use S bus. So earlier when I wired up the VBAT, by using the S port, I can actually send that VBAT information and RSSI through the S port. So the way that all works is on the side here, I'll show you. This little JST connector here, this pin out, this very last pin here is actually the S port, and that's the only one I need. So it came with a plug here, which I've stripped all the other cables out of, and I just have this last one because again that's the only one I need. So that will actually get plugged in, and I have to run that into one of these UART ports, which is going to be this guy right here, UART1 I believe, and I think it's the second to the last pin here. So I have a connector, a plug here, which I also stripped all the wires out except the one I need, so that will just end up plugging in like that. And so the problem is I didn't have any connectors that would go from this UART port directly into this port here, because they're actually different sizes. One's like a JST SH and the other is like a JST PH or something. I think the pitch is different by like 0.25 millimeters. So I have both of these wires, and I'm going to solder them together to make one wire, and I'll run some heat shrink over it just to finish that off. So that'll run the S port, which I need for all my telemetry information, etc. And then all the pins here, trying to remember exactly, but I believe it's like the top or bottom 3 of these pins, and so I'll end up plugging those into this connector, which came with my flight controller, and this will go into an I/O port on the back of the well, it's not really the back, but 90 degrees to the left of the USB here is there's this I/O port. And again, I only need 3 wires, the positive, ground, and signal for that, for running the S bus. And so the S bus I'll end up plugging this guy in like this, and that will run to the pin on the receiver here. So that's how I'm going to run my X4R. You can also, rather than running it to the I/O port here, you can actually run it to like UART3 and just wire up the ground, positive, and receiver. But I find it much cleaner and nicer just to use the plug. So that's how I'm going to do it. So I'll go ahead and get started by soldering these 2 yellow cables together, which I'll be using for the S port. I like to do, for delicate jobs like this, I usually use like 600 degrees on my soldering iron. So let me strip these first. This is a pretty small cable. Actually, I can't even strip this with my stripper because it's so small. This guy, I think I can though. It's a little bit bigger gauge. This guy I'll just have to use the side cutters for. Oh, that didn't work. Alright, I actually cut one of the wires out there a little bit, so I'm going to actually redo that one more time. Such a small gauge wire. There we go. Perfect. Alright, so I'm going to solder these 2 together.
Standing in the street alone. Her head was down, face locked onto the phone. And I wished I'd had a number so I could be caller unknown. And then I tell her to my eyes, I'll never let it go.
There you have it. That's custom wire we have for connecting up our S port. I already have the, let's see, there's the far sky, and then I have this connector already. So now we can basically just plug these in. I'm going to hold off on plugging this in right now because I have to take this flight controller off to do the VTX, which we'll do next. Stay tuned. I'm back. Going to hook up the VTX, the video transmitter here. I have a Foxier 25 switcher. I think it goes between 25 milliwatts, 200 and 600 milliwatts. So I'll go ahead and show you here real quick. Comes just like this. This is kind of the top side. It has a little display and then a little button to switch between the different modes, and then a little pigtail with the SMA connector on the end. Comes with this pin out here, which has a power in, ground, audio, video, ground, and DC 5 volt out. So the DC 5 volt out with the video and the ground, I'm going to run to my video camera, so I will leave that as it is. The audio I don't use, so I'll end up just snipping this, and then these two, the power and the ground here, I'll run to the ports, or to the pads on the PDB. There's a ground and a 12 volt pad here, so I'll just run those there. I like to plug my VTX into the back like this, and then I run that pigtail out to the top of the frame. So I got some extra room with these
Allow me to show you something.
through here, cleaning that up. I think that looks good to me. times just to make sure. I like to run my iron through I just run my iron through there just to make sure that there are gaps between each pad. Looks pretty good though, about as good as I'm gonna do. So that's all wired up, and we should be able to just power this up now, just to see if the VTX powers up. So let's do that. I'll grab the battery. And make sure we're not got anything weird here. I'll just put this on real quick. Alright, and you can see the VTX is powered up and everything's good. So next, I just hooked the camera up here real quick so we can give that a quick test. Got it right here. This is a Runcam Eagle 2 with a nice red aluminum body that I really like. So I have my goggles here, and I'll just power it up and show you that it's hopefully working. Alright. Actually, I'm going to adjust the channel, the band on here real quick to the band that I use. So we'll go... And then I'll just leave it on, well, I'll move to 600 milliwatts for fun. Alright, that's set. Plug this guy in. Alright, I already got video, as you guys can see. Hopefully you can see that. Got the camera hooked up here. Everything appears to be good. I'm quite happy with that. So, I will catch you guys soon. So, we're basically done with the build here. As I said, I was going to waterproof this drone, which I just finished doing. I didn't film it because I already filmed a tutorial on how to do this. I initially used silicone conformal coating, and I applied that as a first layer to all the components, so top and bottom of every component. I applied that stuff. It has a nice brush on the inside, which you can use to brush all the different things, and that provides kind of like a thick rubbery layer. I try not to get that stuff in my connectors too much, just because I'm not sure how conductive it allows the pins to be. And then I followed it up with some Corrosion X HD, which is more of like a grease, and this is very, very greasy, very messy, and it gets everywhere. So I use that in the actual pins, and that doesn't really prevent any conductivity at all. So you can see, you probably can't see as much as it was here earlier, but there was just grease everywhere, and I actually used my air compressor to blow some of the grease off. But I have every component basically completely coated liberally, and now I really just need to hook it all back up onto the frame, and that's over here. So it's just a standard QAV 210 frame. It's not the actual QAV 210 from Luminaire. It's a like look-alike or whatever for much, much less. So this is what it looks like right now. It's all put together. On the sides you can see I've wrapped some electrical tape around it. I just do that to kind of help prevent like different like leaves and grass and stuff from getting in there. These props I use are like 50-40 strikes. and I really like this brand. I think this is made out of like a polycarbonate and a little bit of glass or something, so it's very light still, but also very strong. I found them to work very nicely, and yeah, I mean, that's about it. It's all hooked up. I usually hot glue the pigtail around the VTX here that goes up to the antenna, just so when I crash it doesn't constantly bend that coaxial cable or whatever too much, because eventually it gets like jello and it'll just fall apart. Also, I have this little with the heat shrink, I've kind of made like a V here for best diversity with your receiver antennas. It's usually best to keep them at 90 degrees from each other. I didn't quite get 90 degrees off of that, but it's good enough. I'm happy with it. So, and that's about it. So I'll probably put a GoPro up on the front here on top, and my battery just straps in here and plugs in right here. So yeah, I'm quite happy, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.